Enterprise, which since its inception in 1956 has been educating the public on economic affairs. Continuing with that trend, we are bringing to you Ms.Piya Mahtaney, who will be the speaker for the day. Ms.Piya Mahtaney, having completed her second master's in development economics from Leicester University in England, embarked on a career in journalism with the Times of India. She was assistant editor in Metropolis on Saturday, and later she joined as a senior feature writer in Economic Times. As an economist, she reported, analyzed, and wrote on a wide range of socio-economic issues. Besides authorship, she has been a visiting lecturer with St. Xavier's Institute of Communications and St. Xavier's College, Department of Economics. Ms. Mahtaney also writes a monthly column for Forum Views, which is a magazine brought out by the Bombay Stock Exchange. She is also a member of the Forum's Council of Management. In her personal capacity, her interest lies in classical Western ballet, in which she has been trained since her childhood. In today's webinar, Ms. Mahtaney will speak on the subject, Structural Transformation 2.0 in the Global Economy. She will present a comprehensive and incisive analysis on the subject, which she feels is the most relevant and crucial theme of contemporary economics. Structural transformation, she feels, is the edifice that is the basis of the next phase of economic transformation. We also are thankful to our virtual event partners, 24 Digital Frames, for this live streaming. Thank you, and over to Ms. Mahtaney. Welcome, Ms. Piya Mahtaney.
Good morning to all. And I thank the Forum of Free Enterprise for giving me this opportunity to talk about structural transformation, which, as some of you know, was the main subject that I presented an analysis about in my recent book titled Structural Transformation: Understanding the New Drivers of Investment, Innovation, and Institutions. In this discourse, I will be speaking about some of the insights and inferences and observations that have been drawn from an expanse of empirical evidence that I studied. Empirical evidence that pertains to over 100 countries, and the timeline is over 50 years. Now, I promise that I'm not going to make this a boring discussion, because very often those outside the realm of economics find economic issues not as interesting as those within the realm. I'm going to highlight a few of the critical insights that came to me in the course of my research. And the context, the larger context would be the transition that the global economy is going through. Even as we speak, we find that the global economy is in a state of uncertainty. For some regions, it's in a state of upheaval and tumult. And the future, as we find ourselves headed towards, is one that is wrought with uncertainty and fraught with challenges. Now, challenges and uncertainty are not new, but I think the magnitude of the challenge that we face today and the constraints that the world, when I say we, I mean all of us in the world, the constraints that the world faces today has been unprecedented, at least since the Second World War. And therefore, the need to understand, the need to rethink what has been done, what has not been done, what can be done more effectively and efficiently, so that more countries embark onto the trajectory of development. I remember in my introduction of the book, the first line in the introduction is "The new world is here." And I wrote this line in 2019. Little did I know at the time that in 2020, a year later, the world would find itself in the grip of a pandemic that wreaked havoc. And the world, fortunately, even as most countries are still recovering from the onslaught of the pandemic, but the world has been able to cope with this challenge. Now, there are two ways of looking at the fact that the world has been able to cope with this challenge. One is that it has the resilience. One is that if it had built more resilience, if there had been more development, if there had been less poverty, if there had been better infrastructure, then the onslaught of the pandemic, particularly on the poorer nations, would have been less cruel. And this takes us to the main theme of this discussion, which is structural change. What do we mean by structural change? A subject that has been mentioned, but not much has been done to actually shed understanding about what we mean by structural change. Now, in order to actually shed insight on the subject, I have to take you to 30 years to a point in the global economy, 30 years back, when liberalization was initiated. Now, the exigency of liberalization, the need for liberalization was undoubtedly clear. It was evident. But the practice of liberalization, as it has occurred over the last 3 decades, has been one that in most instances has been almost without inclusive multilateralism. And by that I mean, the practice of liberalization has overlooked in many ways the considerations of development, the considerations of the need to have systems that would encourage consistent economic progress, that would have mechanisms to at least prevent such huge disparities of income, that would have a greater degree of transparency and accountability. So really, we've had this practice of liberalization over the last 3 decades that has not really borne out the promise of liberalization. It has been pretty much a process that is bereft of institutional reform. And I think the most graphic illustration of the fault lines that underpinned this process of liberalization was the crisis of 2008. From 2008 onwards, the world has been struggling with a transition. And the struggle has been one that has, on one hand, coped with the impact of the 2008 meltdown. And on the other hand, it has tried to evolve a system globally that is more resilient. Just when we thought that we would be onto a more consistent path, at least of economic growth, you had the pandemic. But in all fairness, just for the record, even before the pandemic started, the need for an alternative, more sustainable system that would take into account a fair proportion of the ails that had actually set in over the last 3 decades since the early 90s. That systemic framework has not been evolved even after, or has not been evolved enough even after 2008. So the need for structural change continued. If you take at its inception, when economic liberalization seemed to be the direction for every country to pursue in the early 90s, symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall, liberalization at that point seemed this metaphor for freedom. It seemed this metaphor for a greater prosperity. It seemed this metaphor to unleash opportunities to those segments, to those stratas that found themselves struggling to eke out a livelihood. This was what liberalization was made out to be. And in principle, it was in that manner. However, what really happened was that we had a world where China was the biggest beneficiary, I would say, of a process that should have been, as I mentioned earlier, that should have been more multilateral. But as it turned out, it became a process where the maximum gains would percolate to a nation, would be accrued by a nation, or would be accrued to a nation that was not a democracy, that was authoritarian. And I give this example not because of any, not to actually convey any ideological theme, but to say that liberalization, in the way it was practiced, ultimately was whittled down to just mean giving the market forces more latitude, to giving market economy much more importance. This was important, but this was one aspect of liberalization. The other complementary aspects of liberalization, really, which we conveniently debunk as reform, the other complementary aspects of liberalization were just not heeded. Now, one explanation for this that is conveniently and frequently given is that the assumptions were that if you minimize government intervention, if you maximize the role of the private sector, then investment would be allocated more efficiently. You would have capital being allocated more productively. You would have institutions working more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So actually, in retrospect, when along with other economists who viewed this period of 3 decades in the context of development, what is interesting to note is that the assumptions that liberalization was based on, that successful liberalization was based on, those assumptions really were the preconditions for successful liberalization. So those who thought that liberalization alone would enable institutions to function better, that the minimization of government intervention alone would enable capital and investment to be used more productively, that these assumptions were actually the preconditions. And there was nothing automatic about having these mechanisms fall into place just because you initiated a process of liberalization. So the question that does arise is, where do we start this whole exercise of structural change from? The answer is, we start from where we left off. We start with the assumptions that successful liberalization was based on, but those assumptions, as we know, were not met. Now, interestingly, the need for inclusive multilateralism, which is actually the crux of successful liberalization, the need for inclusive multilateralism, was understood even prior to the end of the Second World War, when, and I will be quoting the US Treasury Secretary at the time in 1944, Henry Morgenthau, who at the first meeting of the International Monetary Fund in 1945, who spoke of inclusive multilateralism. And I quote, he says, "I hope that this conference will focus its attention upon two elementary economic axioms. The first of these is that prosperity has no fixed limits. It is not a finite substance to be diminished by division. On the contrary, the more of it that the nations enjoy, the more each nation will have for itself." Way back in 1945, Henry Morgenthau, the then US Treasury Secretary, spoke of prosperity for as many. The course of events since 1945 and up to now provide us with a repeated vindication of the need for inclusive multilateralism, which has not happened. The present geopolitical flux that the world finds itself also coping with is the result of this lack of inclusive multilateralism. The other question that is often asked, in fact, a number of times over the last 2 or 3 years, we've heard the term deglobalization. I'm sure many of you all would have heard that term, deglobalization. And I find that the use of this term deglobalization is almost misplaced. It's misplaced because globalization, in the first place, by definition, should have elicited a greater participation of the developing nations in global decision making, in the configuration of global economics. This did not happen. So globalization, in the same way that liberalization was diminished, globalization was also diminished by a complete lack of institutional reform on one hand, and by a few nations controlling the rules-based world order, which should have given way to a more liberal world order. But a more liberal world order is one that also is shaped by the considerations of the maximum number of nations. And this did not happen. So when we look at globalization, really, what has happened over the last 3 decades is a half-baked, lopsided, asymmetric process of globalizing. Now, are we deglobalizing? How can we speak of deglobalizing? And I think now the term deglobalizing is used less frequently because the pandemic demonstrated that in as much as each nation had to cope with the challenges of the pandemic, what happened in one nation also affected the other. The pandemic demonstrated the degree of interconnect between nations. It's unprecedented. The interconnectedness of the world today is unprecedented. The need to forge common solutions, whether it's to climate change, whether it's to sustainability, whether it's to strategic concerns. And we see this playing out even as I talk. The need for the world to come together on all this is also unprecedented. So globalization is going to be even more important in the ensuing future, as I see, as it was earlier. But the drivers of globalization would be different. Globalization will not be driven by trade liberalization alone. Globalization will be driven by a host of other factors that have so far not been assigned the importance that they should have. Now I proceed to the three critical parameters of structural transformation that I've analyzed in this work. And, I must confess that to sit down and actually enumerate those insights that I would be talking about more and to sort of make up my mind as to what to exclude was not an easy exercise. But my attempt is to shed some light on some of the critical inferences and observations that empirical evidence gives to us. And as I mentioned, it's a huge expanse of empirical evidence that I've looked at. Critical from the point of view of present imperatives, critical from the point of view of having a more sustainable future, critical from the point of view of what has not been done so far. I looked at empirical evidence spanning, as I mentioned, over 5 decades. What I was looking at when I went through this empirical evidence was the development pathways of nations. Those nations that had successful development experiences, those nations that did not have successful development experiences, those nations that developed initially for a certain period of time and somehow at some point they stagnated and there were reversals of economic progress. So what I wanted to do is, I wanted to look at the specifics of development experience for each group of nations, and at the same time, what were the critical factors that drove development across nations. So regardless of the kind of constraints and the kind of strengths that each of these nations had, regardless of the differences in their development experiences, what were the critical drivers of development across nations? And the 3 critical drivers are investment, and of course, capital accumulation, innovation, and institutions. Every nation, in order to spearhead development, have to get the configuration of investment, innovation, and institutions, have to arrive at this configuration of these 3 critical parameters in a way that would spearhead a trajectory of development that is consistent. The lack of development, conversely, can also be explained in terms of investment, innovation, and institutions. That is, it is the inadequacy of investment or the wrong kinds of innovation or the lack of institutions that deter the process of development. Now, the research in all three, across all three parameters is of course exhaustive. And I'm going to, parameter wise, I'm going to look at some of the few observations that I've made and inferences that I have drawn that would be pointers to what we need to understand more about. We need to rethink in the context of better investment choices, rethink in the context of policy priorities, rethink in the context of actually understanding how closely linked certain variables are. So when you look at investment, now the fact is that today, if anyone were to say that development is the lack of, that the underdevelopment persists because of the lack of capital. Now, underdevelopment persists because of the lack of capital is true at the level of the nation. So a particular nation may be capital constrained and therefore, and may be unable to mobilize enough of capital. And that may result in underdevelopment. But at the aggregate level, at the global level, underdevelopment persists not because of an inadequacy of capital. Underdevelopment persists because of an inadequacy of arrangements that would enable the mobilization of productive capital or of capital for productive use by the poorer nations. So it is the lack of mechanisms that are required by poorer nations to mobilize the capital that they require. It is the lack of these mechanisms. It is the lack of the institutional capability that underpins this lack of development. So you have paradoxically a situation where, in spite of there being, even as I speak, even today, an abundance of capital, there is a paucity of capital for use by those countries that are most capital constrained. So this is one of the paradoxes when we look at investment and we find a lack of productive investment across so many nations. And one wonders that there are opportunities out there lying in wait, and yet there is a paucity of investment. Now, one of the facts that we have to understand when we are looking at investment is the distribution of investment. And the fact that there is, even today, in spite of all the financial innovation and ingenuity that we see, there is a lack of financial instruments that can be used by the poorer segments of society. And this is, when I'm talking in the global context. You know, I often hear that, you know, microfinance is an instrument, microfinance is the kind of financing that could have worked wonderfully and has actually in certain regions worked wonderfully, but it could have done much more to alleviate the credit constraints of the poorer segments. But there were problems. Now, the fact remains that microfinance caters to the requirements of some of the poorer stratas. And whatever the problems that it countered can easily be and if not easily, but they are workable, they can be reversed. But the fact that it did not, that microfinance really does not, uh, you know, fulfill the requirements of upper income groups. Upper income groups do not seek recourse to microfinance as do the lower income groups. It continues to be a financial technique that can do much more than it's doing currently. So there is this need for financial intermediation and for financial instruments that are suited for the needs of the poorer sections, that would contribute towards the mobility of investment into productive uses at the lower end, but that is not happening enough. That's the first point. The second point is that when we are looking at developing nations and less developed nations, an important feature that cannot be overlooked is the feature of deindustrialization. Now, in the 50s, and this applies even to India, the general thinking was that if you industrialized, you would be able to provide employment, better employment, to a fair proportion of those people who were dependent on agriculture. And this assumption was on the basis of the experience of countries that had developed earlier, UK, US, some other countries of Europe. Over the last 3 decades, we've seen that industrialization in a number of developing countries has not been able to provide the kind of employment generation that was expected. And in fact, even before countries, in a number of instances, even before countries have reached high levels of per capita income, industrialization has stopped really expanding. Or even if it does expand, it expands at a much slower pace. And the dependence on the primary sector, the dependence on agriculture continues. So this phenomenon of industrialization either contracting in terms of the rate of growth of the sector and its contribution to the GDP of a nation, this contraction of industrial growth or the stagnating industrial growth at levels of per capita income that are much lower than what was previously observed is referred to as deindustrialization. And most developing and less developed nations encounter this feature of deindustrialization. Now, how does this impact policy choices? How it impacts policy choices is that the assumption that one sector would grow rapidly while the other sector becomes less important, that the industrial sector would expand at a pace which would be much higher than the agricultural sector. And in that sense, it would be more important and it would provide the employment generation to those workers that left the agricultural sector. I think this is a generalization that we need to rethink. In contemporary developing countries today, all sectors, industry, agriculture, and service, have to grow, perhaps not at the equivalent pace, but they have to grow concurrently. And the policy choices that are made cannot assign more importance to one and less importance to the other. In India, of course, the nature of the agricultural sector is such that even today, with 60% of the population or perhaps slightly less than that, dependent for their employment in the agricultural sector, even though the agricultural sector contributes much less to India's GDP. The productivity of the agricultural sector is key to India's economic progress. And also, we have to understand that the growth of each sector is interlinked with that of the other. This was a point that was demonstrated quite vividly by the pandemic. The interconnect, the intersector, what in economics is referred to as intersectoral linkages. So that is one aspect. Now, my contribution to this analysis, if I may use the term contribution, is that I remember when we were in college, and for those who are familiar with basic economic theory, we learned about Arthur Lewis. Arthur Lewis was an economist who wrote about economic structures in developing and less developed nations. And Arthur Lewis said that he actually depicted that a nation's progress is incumbent on the industrial sector being able to provide the employment to a fair proportion of those who were earlier dependent on the agricultural sector, but who have since migrated to industry for their livelihoods. And the increasing role of the industrial sector to provide employment to those who had left the agricultural sector, until such time that the agricultural sector becomes extremely productive in that it has not many dependent on it, and it also becomes productive in terms of its yield. So you have a vibrant industrial sector which has provided the employment to a fair proportion of those who were earlier dependent on the agricultural sector, and you have a productive agricultural sector with minimum slack. Now, this was Arthur Lewis's prescription for economic progress, and he called it the model of economic dualism. And he said that it is only when the industrial sector is able to absorb all those who were earlier dependent on the agricultural sector that a country would develop. And in many ways, Arthur Lewis was proved correct. The possibility of that happening today, as I just mentioned, is unrealistic. So what I did was I added a modification to Arthur Lewis's prescription. In that I said that we have to see within each sector, whether it's a service sector, whether it's the agricultural sector, we have to see that each of these sectors has, for instance, when you look at the service sector, you have the unorganized segment. When you look at the agricultural sector, you have the non-farming segment. You have within each sector those segments that are more productive, that are more skilled, that are, if I may use the word modern, that are relatively more advanced, and the absorption of labor by those sectors, the provision of employment in those segments in each sector that are more advanced in terms of the skills that they have, in terms of the capital outlays that they can mobilize. In those segments, if employment is generated, so if, for instance, in the service sector, if there is more formalization of employment, or in the agricultural sector, if more employment is generated by the non-farming segment, what you would have is an absorption of workers by segments that are more advanced, that are more skilled, that have better infrastructure. And that would be certainly a driver of economic progress. So I think this is something that we need to rethink, that dualism can be an advantage, it is not a disadvantage. But we need to see that the dualism that exists is not one that results in more disparity, but is one where an increasing degree of formalization and increasing levels of productivity drive economic progress. Now, the other point that coming to the other parameter of innovation. Now, innovation was an area that was absolutely, when I started my research on this, I found that this is really a vast area, because there is the technical dimension and there is the non-technological dimension. And it's interesting that most of us, when we envision an innovation, either when we think of innovation or when we talk of innovation, we think of state-of-the-art technology. And it is this thinking, if I may take the liberty to say, that has actually constricted innovation, because innovation is much broader than state-of-the-art technology. Innovation is a process that encapsulates both technological and non-technological dimensions. And understanding the interrelationships between this becomes very important if a country is to nurture the kind of innovation it requires. Many generalizations, many assumptions insofar as innovation, particularly with respect to developing and less developed nations that have been made, have in a sense been narrow in their focus and have overlooked a number of considerations that are specific to developing and less developed countries. Now, in order for me not to actually exclude some of the important points that I have listed out for innovation, I'll just be looking at my note. One of the interesting and rather ironical observations that I've heard made over the last 3 or 4 years is this whole hype about the fourth industrial revolution that would be ushered in by this sweep of technological advances, robotics, artificial intelligence, what have you. Fascinating is the sweep of the next set of technological advances. But really, the crux of the matter is that there exists a backlog of existing technological advances and innovations that can enable poorer nations to actually overcome the constraints that they have, whether it's the constraint of power, electricity, whether it's the constraint of drinking water, whether it's the constraint of sanitation, whether it's the constraint of basic medical infrastructure. And yet, this backlog of technological advances has yet to percolate to the poorest nations of the world. So, if you look at the present circumstances that developing nations and less developed nations, look at the nations of Africa, for instance. You don't need to wait for the fourth industrial revolution to see that these constraints, that basic constraints are met. Basic infrastructural constraints and amenities can be provided by the knowledge that exists currently. So when I was looking at innovation, I said it is not merely the need for technological innovation. It is the need for having an ecosystem that encourages the implementation of existent technological advances, which have been in existence for decades, but which need capital, which need institutions, which needs, if I may add, the right kind of macroeconomic interventions to be able to percolate those levels which find themselves shackled by development constraints for decades. So you might have a situation where you would not just have one industrial revolution in trying to meet the constraints that are confronted by developing nations. You would have perhaps 3 industrial revolutions run concurrently. So that is one aspect. The other aspect is that I remember reading this when I was going through the nature of technology. One of the economists, Robert Gorton, he said that, well, the technology that the world saw up to the early 70s was game-changing in its impact insofar as it enabled an improvement in the standard of living. You know, people accessed drinking water, people had electricity, people had the motor car, people had the railway, people had vaccinations, people had medicines that cured the worst kind of infections. So those were game-changing inventions. But after the 70s, the kind of innovations that have taken place on the technological frontier have not been as game-changing insofar as its impact on the standard of living. This is the second point. The third point is that often one wonders that why is it that even when developing countries have imported or have utilized advanced technologies, the results, the outcomes of that utilization have not been as anticipated. They have not been able to achieve the levels of progress that advanced nations have been able to with the utilization of the same technologies. So technological advancement is an outcome not just of technology, but as I mentioned, of a complementary ecosystem, that was built in the advanced nations of Europe and the US at the time that the Industrial Revolution was initiated. And you know, when I looked at the history of the Industrial Revolution, I found that, interestingly, the technological advances that underpinned the Industrial Revolution was only one part of the revolution. There were other non-technological factors that drove the implementation and the percolation and the absorption of these technologies. And it is the focus on these non-technological factors that become critical to realizing the gains from technology. Now, in this context, what I did was, when I went through the research so far as technology is concerned, when I looked at developing and developed nations, I found that it's important to actually understand the processes involved in getting to that level of economic advancement, where technological progress becomes an important driver of economic advancement, understanding why in certain instances technological progress does not drive economic development and why in certain areas it does. For instance, in East Asia today, you know, you had Japan, you had South Korea, you had Taiwan, you had Hong Kong, you had Singapore. These were the early developers of East Asia. And the reason that technology played the dynamic role of driving economic progress. And the same technology elsewhere, for instance, in Latin America, did not have that impact. So in order to understand the processes better, what I did was I evolved what I call the techno-economic paradigm, where I said that the three constituents of technological progress in any country, and this is based on fairly exhaustive research, is there are three phases. There is adoption, there is assimilation, and there is the use of appropriate technology, appropriateness. And these three constitutions make up what I call the techno-economic paradigm, which is the interrelationship that technological advance, any technological advancement, whether it's technological advancement in general or whether it's a particular technology, if it is to drive economic progress in any nation, what are the phases that it would have to pass? It would have to be adopted across segments. It would have to be the right kind of technology, and it would have to be assimilated. Now, when I talk about assimilation, what do I mean? I mean that a country has to have the capability and the competence to use that technology productively. So for instance, if you buy a desktop and you don't know how to use it, and you don't know the purpose for it, for which it's to be used, just to give a rudimentary example, that desktop will be lying in your room and you would just be, doing what you're doing in the same manner that you did before the desktop. So training and capability building is integral to be able to use that technology that you've imported or you've acquired productively. And, in the course of my research about knowledge accumulation is therefore, when we talk about capability and competence building, we are talking about a process of knowledge accumulation. What are the sources of knowledge accumulation in any country? Whether it's from the educational sector, whether it's in terms of training, whether it's in terms of the information that you have, whether it's in terms of understanding from prior experience, a priori knowledge, all this and more constitutes sources of knowledge accumulation. So the technological progress that a nation wants to achieve, its impact on development would depend critically on the sources of knowledge accumulation, the extent of knowledge accumulation, and what a nation is doing to drive knowledge accumulation. The presence of a particular technology does not guarantee that you would have in requisite measure knowledge accumulation. That is again a function of investment in training, in education, institutional mechanisms to ensure that that training, that educational impartation is in line with the technology that you want to bring in, is in line with the technological progress that you want to achieve. And therefore, this brings us to the critical point of the fact that you cannot emulate a country's technological advancement. You can understand that a country has been able to achieve a certain milestone in economic progress as a result of adopting a set of technologies, as a result of the role that that technology plays. But you cannot emulate a course. And that's why, while advanced nations used a certain set of technologies and developed as a result, developing nations have not had the same outcomes because they've not had the requisite knowledge accumulation and they have not achieved the per capita incomes that those nations have achieved. Knowledge accumulation for a developing country and a developed country differs. And therefore, concurrent with technological upgradation is the importance of building knowledge accumulation. It's the importance of understanding your strengths, not in terms of just resources that you have, and this is very important. It is important to understand your strength in terms of the capabilities that you can build and the competences that you can build. The third and the last parameter that I'd like to talk of is actually, I found it the toughest because in the course of my research, I found that as an economist, when you try to understand institutions, you also need to understand the role of political change and the role of social change. So there is an anthropological and a political dynamic to understanding institutions. And I would not really like to say much about the ideological side of institutions, because for that, I think a separate discourse is required, particularly when the world seems to be polarized on ideological lines. But the fact of the matter is that I think this whole exercise of liberalization and globalization, not really realizing the gains that it could have gained, we can to a large extent understand the lack of institutional reform. What do we mean by institutional reform? Now, here I would like to read out a definition that is used quite frequently to actually define institutions. And this definition is by Douglas North. And he says that institutions actually are those incentives that structure human interaction. So institutions and incentive systems are linked. Why certain policy choices are not implemented effectively, why certain policy choices are implemented effectively, why society behaves in a certain way that is detrimental to development, why it behaves in a way that is not detrimental to development. Corruption, why does it persist? Why is there a lack of accountability? I think all this is very wonderfully understood when we understand that incentives ultimately work through incentive systems. And it is changing these incentive systems. So it is changing the incentive systems for corruption. It is changing the incentive systems for rent seeking. Why is it that the world is still in a mode where it continues to follow a path that is unsustainable? The whole thing ultimately boils down to, if we perceive something as a benefit, we perceive something as a benefit because the cost of pursuing that, either we don't know about those costs, or if we know about those costs, we think the costs are less than the benefit. So institutions have a role in correcting incentive systems. And institutions, by institutions, I don't mean just governance. Governance, of course, is an integral part of institutions. By institutions, I mean governance, society, particularly those better positioned in society. And an entire gamut of non-state actors, the educational institutions, the NGOs, those who may not be politicians, but who drive political change. What is interesting about institutional change today is that nobody can deny that today, as the world finds itself grappling with the constraints, sustainability, high inequalities of income, climate change, and the need to avert worse turmoils and more dramatic reversals, make institutional change an imperative. And this is something that cannot be denied in spite of ideological differences. For instance, sustainable development. The world is now agreed upon the need for sustainable development, and sustainable development alone requires a change in the way institutions function. One change, one game-changing modification can trigger a series of other changes. So even as I speak today, given the current situation, it's not very easy to actually bet on institutional change, but I bet on institutional change because never before have the imperatives been so obvious. There were imperatives earlier for institutional reform, but I think that they are really stark now. The last point that I would like to add here is that, when we talk about information, the information age, I think one factor that needs to be viewed carefully here is that the information age and connectivity has also given to the lowest income groups something that they didn't have earlier, awareness. And I think this heightened degree of awareness, which has been able to break the barriers of income demarcations, I think this would be one of the biggest triggers for institutional change. Thank you.
Thank you, Piya. Thank you for this very detailed and very incisive study of yours, which you have presented today. Thank you very much. We thank our virtual streaming partner, 24 Frames Digital, for supporting us in all our webinars. And we also thank the participants, the audience, who took their time and they were present today to listen to this wonderful analysis by Ms. Mahtaney. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you soon. Thank you.